I'm disappointed and frankly shocked that the majority party and the chairman would choose such an inflammatory title for this hearing by calling it Jim Crow 2021. The lack of judgment in this instance not only belittles those who endured such dehumanization and indignities through the Jim Crow era, and it also reminds all of us, or certainly should, of what Jim Crow was and how and when it happened and under whose leadership. We have to remember that it was, in fact, Republicans who pushed through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Constitution following the Civil War. 13th Amendment getting rid of slavery. 14th Amendment guaranteeing all Americans, and including black Americans who had been slaves and those who would not, equal protection under the laws. And including the 15th Amendment guaranteeing black Americans the right to vote. These had a significant effect. They were enacted with great opposition coming from the Democratic Party. We got them through. The 15th Amendment was the last of the three to be ratified. It was ratified on March 30th, 1870. 1870 was a big turning point for civil rights in America, for black Americans. It was in 1870 that we saw the very first member of Congress, a gentleman by the name of Joseph Rainey, who was elected to the House of Representatives in 1870. The same year, the first black American was elected to the United States Senate. That's Hiram Rhodes Revel, who was elected to the Senate, the U.S. Senate from Mississippi. All in all, during the Reconstruction period, there were 16 black Americans elected to the Congress. There were over 600 black Americans elected to state legislatures, and there were hundreds and hundreds more elected to local positions throughout the country. All of them, every last one of them, happened to be Republican. Jim Crow was a response to that. White Americans who didn't want black Americans coming into power and who resented their votes as Republicans, in fact, didn't want them to have the right to vote at all, notwithstanding the fact that the 15th Amendment had by then been ratified, figured out a way to suppress them. And once President Rutherford Hayes, through the Compromise of 1877, ordered the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, it paved the way for Jim Crow. Jim Crow policies restricted unconstitutionally the right of black Americans to vote, and it restricted all kinds of other behaviors put in place by Democratic governments in each of those states. It was an unfortunate era, one that lasted for roughly a century, to make sure that black Americans could not only not vote, but they couldn't be elected. Michael Lancaster is the Georgia State Director of the Frederick Douglass Foundation and the descendant of people who suffered under Jim Crow. In a recent Washington Times article, Mr. Lancaster stated, quote, comparing absentee ballot changes and ID requirements to banning black people from restaurants and drinking fountains is absurd. A civil debate about voting rights is an important conversation to have, but comparing Georgia's election reform to Jim Crow is simply insulting to my black ancestors who suffered through those dehumanizing segregation laws. There are some others who wrote, quote, it has become clear that even well-intentioned critics of the Georgia law simply have no idea what the law is. It is clear that they have no idea how favorably Georgia's new law compares with most other states, including President Biden's home state of Delaware. And it's clear that they have no idea that a majority of black voters across the country support key provisions attacked by critics, including the provision that it's a simple requirement that voters be able to identify themselves upon voting. Speaker Jones, as I understand it, 77% of Americans support voter ID requirements, and specifically 74% of Georgians, including 63% of black voters in Georgia, all of whom, and all of those numbers indicate support for the new Georgia voter ID requirements. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator.
And so if a potential absentee voter in Georgia does not have a driver's license, he or she could also show a state-issued voter ID card. Is that also correct?
That is correct, or one of the other forms of federally accepted forms of ID.
And if somebody doesn't have that, then that could be provided free of charge. Is that also right?
That is correct. At any Department of Motor Vehicles office or at any of the 159 elections boards. But please, if I may, Senator, the voter ID requirements are not more restrictive for absentees now than they have been widely accepted and certainly not criticized in the past for Georgia. It's precisely the same requirements to vote in person or to vote by absentee. It actually seems kind of incongruent to make rules for one form of voting but not another. But thank you, Senator.
I also want to thank my friend and Utah colleague, Congressman Burgess Owens. This is a man who has been alive, has existed in this country at a time when Jim Crow laws were still in effect. And in some ways, he's been subjected to some of the same insults underlying Jim Crow. He's been lampooned. He's been drawn in caricatures alongside a Klansman in a brazen act of demeaning someone based on his race, demeaning him in a way that ignores the truth, the reality behind Jim Crow laws. This was a system of laws designed to help hold Black Americans back. Hold them back in part because white Democrats in the South didn't want them to vote and didn't like the fact that they were voting as and being elected as Republicans. So let's not compare a voter registration law, one that makes sure that dead people can't vote, to that. We can do better than that, and we should.
Thank you, Senator Lee. For the record, and I will concede, the era of Jim Crow in the South was propagated primarily by Democrats, Southern Democrats and segregationists. The political alignment changed in America starting in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, and Republicans became more dominant in those states for the most part. What we have today is the party of Lincoln, which is refusing to join us in extending the Voting Rights Act. That used to be a bipartisan exercise. Democrats support the extension of the Voting Rights Act and trying to overcome the Shelby County decision and making certain that we can review every state's activities as to whether or not they are fair or not fair.
Mr. Chairman, if I could respond to that.
You may, of course.
For a moment. Look, Republicans never ceased to be the party, never ceased to be the party that believes that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments matter, and that the inherent dignity of the immortal human soul is such that it should never be denigrated by subjecting someone based on their race to a lack of civil rights. So it's not fair, it's not accurate to portray the two parties as having somehow crossed as if in the 1950s. It's just
Senator,
not accurate. And yeah, some Southern Democrats later became Republicans. That's true. That didn't change the Republican Party's alignment on this issue.
My point was the political alignment has changed. That's obvious. And secondly, the Voting Rights Act, which is the nature and subject of this hearing, used to be a 98-0 proposition. Now only Democrats will vote for it since Congressman Sensenbrenner is gone.
Yeah, you're talking about Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which subjects some states to pre-clearance. The designation of pre-clearance and concerns of a constitutional nature raised by the Supreme Court of the United States itself is very different than stated opposition to the Voting Rights Act itself and to the many other provisions that have done some good and that still have overwhelmingly, entirely bipartisan support. And I resent that.
Well, I'm sorry you resent it, Senator, but it's a fact that we are dealing with a Voting Rights Act which used to be universal and bipartisan and now is not. The Democrats support it, the Republicans do not.
Yeah, it is not accurate to say Democrats support the Voting Rights Act and Republicans do not. We're talking about a particular application of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that, based on its implementation and based on the failure to update findings, was leaving some states unconstitutionally, in the judgment of the Supreme Court of the United States, in a different position.
I happen to disagree with that.